This is Rob Kent, and this is another episode of Middle Grade Ninja TV. I am the author of Banneker Bones and the Giant Robot Bees, which is available in paper book and audiobook, narrated by the wonderful David Radke. And the electronic book is available to download free whenever you're viewing this in anticipation of the sequel, Banneker Bones and the Alligator People, coming soon. Under the super secret pen name, Robert Kent, I have written some horror novels, which you are also free to check out. The first chapter of my horror anthology, The Book of David, is available to download as electronic book as well. And I also run the website middlegradeninja.com, where I interview literary agents, publicity people, anything related to publishing, as well as some of my favorite authors, including our guest today, one of my most favorite authors, Barbara Shoup, who is also, in addition to being a young adult author, the executive director of the Indiana Writers Center. Barb, how you doing?
I am well.
Thank you so much for joining us and being here today. So why don't we get started with, why don't you tell the esteemed viewer a little bit about your writing and your writing career?
Sure. I write both for young adults and for adults. I have a variety of kinds of books, and I also have a couple of books about the creative process, which I'm very interested in. As far as my writing career goes, I wanted to be a writer from the time I was, before, as soon as I knew what books were and knew that they were written by people, then I wanted to do that. So my story is that I wrote my first novel when I was about 11. It was called Slave Girl. This was in the 50s during the period of time of integration. And so I was watching all these things on television that were very distressing to me. And so I don't know how my little writer brain worked, but the book was about a little black girl who was escaping an underground railroad from the South to the North. So I wrote that book secretly in my bedroom. Nobody knew I was doing it. When I finished it, I copied it and I sent it away to New York because I found the name in a publisher's name in a library book. And then later found out that the Underground Railroad was not a subway as I had imagined. So that was the end of my writing career at age 11, because I just assumed that I was too stupid to be a writer. And I knew even then that you didn't want people in New York laughing at you. Not that they did. They sent me a very nice, rejection letter, my first. But I really didn't write again for 20 years. And I finally started writing again when I began to teach. I was in my late 20s. And I was lucky. I started taking classes at the Writers Center. And I don't know what I would have done had that not been here, because I had no training in writing at all. I had a degree in elementary ed and had done a little bit of work there. So, it was great for me to have classes with real writers. I didn't know any real writers before that. And so I started taking classes here at the Writers Center. And I was very lucky. I published a first novel within a couple of years after I started writing, which I didn't realize until later was very unusual. So I published that book, and I published it. It was so long ago, it was Harper and Row. Now it's HarperCollins. But then I went 12 years in between. The first one and the second one. And that was really hard. I was teaching all that time, and teaching was really good for me because I told my high school kids what I had to tell myself. It's all about the process. You got to keep at it. You can't control certain things, but you can control whether you write or not. And so I did keep writing. And then the next book that I wrote turned out to be a YA. I didn't know that when I was writing it. It was called Wish You Were Here. It was about, it really grew from my experiences as a teacher at Broad High School here in Indianapolis. And what I was noticing, and this would have been like the mid 1980s, was that so many of my kids were from families that had split up. And this was kind of new. There weren't that many people. I mean, I honestly can't remember anybody from my childhood whose parents were divorced. And so I felt like I was seeing something kind of new in the universe. And it was sort of heartbreaking to me. So if I really write for myself, and I don't have an audience particularly in mind when I'm writing. But if I would have been asked, I would have said, well, I think parents need to know what it's like for their kids, because it was my generation, the baby boomers. And because we hadn't had that experience ourselves, we really didn't know how hard it was. And so anyway, I sent it to my agent, and she said, people don't like to read about teenagers. And I thought, really? I do. I find that time of life very interesting. But in any case, long story short, it ended up being published by Hyperion in 1994. So that was my first. And I've, published fairly regularly ever since then. As I said, some for adults and some for young people.
And your newest, of course, is the brilliant novel Looking for Jack Kerouac.
Looking for Jack Kerouac. Yeah, don't you love that cover?
That is one of my new favorite books.
Oh, thanks.
By an Indiana author about Indiana folks. No one should miss it.
Thanks.
So going back to Wish You Were Here real quick, when did you know that was a young adult novel, or did you know until people told you after it was published?
I didn't. And in fact, to be honest, I had some mixed feelings about it, because at that time, that was 1994, it was kind of just at the beginning of what I think of as real YA books, YA books that were, I hadn't even heard that term. I mean, there have always been books for young people, for teenagers, but, they were kind of more romance books. And when I was growing up, I always wanted to go in the adult section because that's where the real stuff was. And, when I began to realize that people really were writing books, good books for young people, I was good with it. But at first I was like, wait a minute, I don't know about that. And it is true, sometimes that people, it's kind of like, well, gee, that's really good. Are you going to write an adult book sometime soon? Like you have to do this before you do the other, which is so totally not true. It's a kind of book, and it's a wonderful kind of book, and it's every bit as difficult to write as any other kind of book. So I've been kind of interested in that phenomenon too.
Now, have you found that reaction from people has changed over time now that we're in the advent of the young adult novel?
Not among certain kinds of writers. I have, what I mean? The people who are maybe kind of more consider themselves to be literary writers.
Oh, sure, the jerks.
Yeah, they kind of give you a little bit of an eye. But one thing I have noticed is that, people that are coming out of the MFA programs who never would have considered that in the past are now seeing it as a good market. So you're seeing, maybe a little bit more acceptance of it than there used to be. But one of the things I also think is interesting about that is that you really have to be a certain kind of person to write young adult novels. It's not just because it's a good idea and it's marketable. Years ago, I heard Maurice Sendak. He was here for a library talk, the big library talk that they have every year. And someone asked him, for advice, what advice do you have to give to a person who wants to write for children? And he said, I don't write for children. I write as a child. And that just totally blew my mind, because the more I thought about it, the more I think that that's really true, that the people who write for young adults who are really good, they can get right back in there in that period of time. It's always there, for better or worse, often worse. That teenage part of you is very accessible. And if it's not accessible, then the YA books you write are not going to have the kind of heart that they need to have, I think.